Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host and author, Ron Ovitt. Today we're looking at Lesson 39. We're going to be spending a little while now talking about shame. Now, we've just finished talking about having a clear conscience. We've talked about doing a moral inventory, taking amends, and one thing that can keep us from a clear conscience is shame. We talked about false guilt. Well, shame is the result of that. And so today we want to kind of dive a little deep into what is shame, some examples of shame. We're going to pull out some authors, and it may take you a couple times to read it to really grasp what they're saying, but they've really done some great jobs on explaining shame. And so I encourage you, take your time, read the notes. And if you don't have the notes, you can write me at ron@empowerministry.org. That's ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send them to you. You know, shame is the number one enemy of emotional resilience. We talk about emotional resilience, which is what? The ability to bounce back. But when we sense shame, it keeps us down there, keeps us in our place, right? And it keeps us from being able to bounce back to joy. But I'll start off saying this: shame is a liar. Shame is something that just demolishes our ego. It just puts us down, and the trouble is, it's not true. Now, we may do some shameful things. That's why we talk about making amends, right? That's why we talk about doing an inventory, and we get over it. But shame says, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. The trouble is, many of us suffer with toxic, unhealthy shame. I know I was shame-based for much of my life. I didn't have a handle, I didn't know what to call it. It wasn't until I started studying years later that I discovered, I'm shame-based. There was something about me that I just felt shameful. It's more than an emotion. It's a belief about ourselves. It's a body posture, right? Have you ever seen someone do the walk of shame? I know I have. I've done it. And it's this felt sense. It's a dread. We don't always put words on it. It's bodily. It's embodied emotion. The painful feeling can be triggered from something we have done. That can potentially cause us to lose respect of others. But we take it much farther. See, it could be, gee, I'm ashamed I did that, right? I'm ashamed I did that. That's one thing. But to feel this dread and this, shame, that's taking it much farther. It's a sense of irrefutable damage that will lead to total abandonment. It confirms a deep woundedness in our hearts which says, I must be good. I must please everyone. I can't do anything wrong. And behind every one of those phrases is a consequence, or else. And I know that's how I was raised, with this conditional love, and somehow I took it to the extreme. And so it was that I had this shame-based feeling about myself, that there was something drastically wrong, and I had to be good. I had to be a people pleaser. And I felt unlovable. And maybe many of you feel that way too. Well, I'm here to tell you there's hope today. There is hope. We don't have to live in that kind of shame. Why? Because God created us, and He didn't create you in shame. And so we're going to get into that during this series. One of the best books, called Shame and Grace, was written by Lewis Smedes, and he says this: unhealthy shame is a shame about our very selves. Not about some bad thing we did or said, but about who we are. It tells us that we're unworthy, totally. It's not a few stitches that need mending, it's the whole fabric that is frayed. We feel that we're unacceptable, damaged goods, and to feel that is a life-wearying heaviness. And he's so right. He's so right. Shame is best understood as an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. Shame can lead to fear and anger, and it's the greatest obstacle to returning to joy, to being emotional resilient. Why? Because shame makes us afraid to be authentic and attuned to others. Shame prevents us from accepting love that we don't think we earned. And belonging to others that could help us on our journey is tenuous at best and only a failure away. Shame tells us we're unworthy, unlovable, and worst of all, incapable of change. And if we're bold enough to start to feel good about ourselves, take off our mask, right, and stop trying to people please, shame tells us it's no use. We'll never be good enough, and we'll look for any excuse to put us back in our place. I know I experienced that so many times. And just when I would step out, maybe something would humiliate me, or someone would say something, and I took it so hard. And when I would come into a group, as professional as I was, and I'm with other professionals, I'd kind of come in like this, kind of like I'm not worthy. What am I doing here? And when I would come into a room, it was constantly like there was a predator in the room. I was hyper vigilant, on guard to make sure that I would be okay, that I wouldn't do something foolish. And I remember even getting up in the morning sometimes thinking, what am I going to do today to make sure that I do everything right? Or I better not do this, where I won't be wrong. It's a horrible way to live. And yet it was my norm. I didn't know it was anything until I really started putting all this stuff together and working on this, that I really realized how shame-based I really was. Now, Patrick DeYoung has written a lot in her classic book, Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame. And she's one of the authors in here. And I've written a lot from her because she's so good. But it may take a couple readings to really grasp what she's saying, because she says it, as if you're a therapist in a way, but she's making good sense. And I encourage you, if you really want to know, take your time and read what she has to say and catch the little nuances. But let me tell you a little bit of what she says. She says, people report that shame makes them feel blank, vaporized, and incoherent, even to themselves. In moments of feeling humiliated, they can't speak or even think. They feel shattered, or as if they are falling apart. The threat of psychological annihilation is mirrored by their wish to sink through the floor or disappear in some way, to cease to exist. And I remember, even when I was older, in my 40s and my 50s and in executive positions, if I felt that my department or I did something that wasn't quite right, or if I needed to be called into the CEO or something like that, I remember sometimes if I did something and they talked to me about it with a certain tone, I would be like this. And I knew, and I was saying to myself, look up, what are you doing? Look at him in the face, but I couldn't. It's like she said, I felt like I was vaporizing. I felt like I was going into the floor. I was hot. I felt embarrassed. It was all this kind of feeling, and I was fighting it, knowing, come on, Ron, stop it. But that's how shame is. And I decided, I got to figure this out. And as I started this class, almost 15 years ago now, I decided that shame was going to be one of the topics that I wanted to do deep dive into for myself and for so many of those that I've worked with. And so this self-annihilation, right? I feel like I'm going to be annihilated. And I'll never forget, I was reading a book, and all of a sudden I ordered another copy. And it was about adoptions, because I had been working with adoptions and that. But they sent me a different book by the same title. And in there, they were talking about alcoholism. So I thought, oh, gee, these guys talk about alcoholism too. And they talked about why do some people drink. And one of the words they said was the fear of non-being. And all of a sudden I went, that's what it is. And I remember for years, I felt like when I felt this sense of shame that there was a trap door right behind me, and someone was going to pull this lever, and I was just going to fall down and keep falling, and it's terrified me. And it was this fear of non-being. And it wasn't until I really started working in substance abuse and others that I found other people that had similar feelings. I started studying it. And she's right on when she says this. And I encourage you to really read this, right? And so she talks about shame in quite a way. She says, when a pleasurable pattern of neural firing is suddenly interrupted, and that's what's happening, the rupture is embodied in downcast eyes, in slump of muscle tone, and visible in the head and the shoulders, and a sense of confusion and disorientation. And that's what's happening. We're going our way, and all of a sudden, bam, something comes, and all of a sudden we feel vulnerable. We feel like we're going to die. And it's a body. In little children, it's an affect. It's the way the body responds. As the child gets older, it's an emotional response. You see, shame starts off, it comes from our relationships. It comes from those early relationships, and then later it becomes a self-definition. It almost becomes a trait. And it comes sometimes from the trauma that we receive as children. This false guilt, the shame, the self-bitterness, the self-rejection, self-hatred. And Dr. DeYoung explains it this way. She says, I become a self-disintegrating in relationship to the dysregulating other. Now let me unpack that. She says, as children, we're supposed to be integrated. Our parents are our emotional regulators. They're supposed to help us regulate, return to joy. And so even if a rupture comes, what are you doing, right? And the child looks like this. The parent comes back and repairs it, says, I'm sorry, I got a little angry, but son, you can't be doing that. But when there's no repair, when the caregiver who loves us, right, doesn't repair, we're left there with this disintegrating. And they're the ones that are supposed to be the regulating other. And so that's what she's talking about. They're dysregulating instead of regulating. And I'm becoming disintegrated. Now, I know those are words in here. Again, I invite you to read it. But, this integration is between the ability to what? Be emotionally resilient. To be able to return to the fruit of the Spirit, the love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, and self-control. And that's why God reparenting us is so important. And we're going to talk about that in some lessons ahead. You aren't going to want to miss that. Well, she said, what happens then when I'm in this affective state of distress, or a child when I'm feeling this rush of emotion, their response fails to help me manage what I'm feeling. Instead of feeling connected to someone strong and calm, I feel alone. Instead of feeling contained, I feel out of control. Instead of feeling energetically focused, I feel overwhelmed. Instead of feeling that I'll be okay, I feel like I'm falling apart. This kind of experience is the core experience of shame. All of it has something to do with needing something intensely from someone important and something going wrong with the interaction between us. I feel I can't make it happen what I need from you. I can't make it happen. And if the sequence is repeated often enough in my development to become an expectable experience, it becomes expected. And if I will have a core then propensity to feel shame whenever I feel strong feelings and need emotional connection, or feel something is wrong on an interpersonal interaction. In all of those situations, I'll be likely to conclude, now listen, it'll be consciously or unconsciously, I'll conclude there's something wrong with me. There is something wrong with what I need, with my needy self. And as I grow from toddler to a young child, I'll make that sort of sense in any integrated situation that feels bad to me. I will come to believe that there is badness inherent in my disconnected emotional self who feels those bad feelings. Shame is pervasive. And it starts in early childhood and it continues as we grow up. Now, there's a difference between toxic shame and healthy remorse. We've been talking about making amends. That's a healthy remorse. And remorse, unlike shame, can be healthy. And a godly remorse is a response to true guilt that leads us to repentance. It is feeling ashamed, that momentarily feeling of regret over something that was said or done. And remorse and regret then look at the situation and ramifications and conditions for what? For making restitution. And that's what we've just been through to keep our conscience clear. Some would call that healthy shame, and I would agree. However, it's hard to separate that if it becomes a judgment of who I am. I can feel ashamed where I have a painful feeling of dishonor or disgrace over something I have done, but that's different than a feeling of shame. Shame is not an attitude about what I've done, but an attitude about me. I am more than dishonored over this situation. I am dishonorable. Do you see the difference? Do you see the difference? Shame crosses over into a toxic emotion. And unfortunately, it affects the way that we react to things, and we want to escape. And we've talked about escapes before, where we tend to go into all these things like, an overindulgence in excitement or substance, compulsive behavior, avoidance, people, emotionalism, sex, and we escape into those things. And a lot of times it starts in the home. And our home can be full of shame. And Dr. Brene Brown has written a lot on shame. She's researched shame. She's written many books on it. She talks about a house rules that fill us full of shame. And she says, here's some of the rules that we were taught as children. Number one, be blind. As children, we're taught to ignore the negative things that go on. We're to be blind to role reversal, where I'm taking care of the parent instead of them taking care of me. We're to be oblivious to mixed messages like I'm proud of you even though you're good for nothing, right? And we're taught to be quiet. Be quiet. Many families have secrets. And sometimes they're based on real situations, like someone in a family is involved in addictions, or there's abuse going on, or there's unfaithfulness, or violence, or poverty, and we're to be quiet. We're not to let anyone know. And this pervasive shame starts coming. We're taught to feel ashamed. And sometimes it's over nothing. I mean, how many times, we can't invite anyone over because the house is a mess, when really it's pretty darn clean. Or don't ask the neighbors for anything. Don't you go take this. Don't go bother anybody. And so we're supposed to be quiet and don't bother anyone. Or to be dumb. There's an unwritten rule that parents are always right, and so we're not allowed to, say anything. And so any of our feelings are shamed. They're put down. We're stuffed down. And, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. Or that was the stupidest thing I ever heard. Just do as I say, okay? Don't worry about what I'm doing, right? And sometimes be numb. And that rule involves emotions. We're taught to not express our emotions. Quit crying. What are you, a child? Quit acting like a child. And yet we are, right? And we're going to betray this illusion that everything's perfect in our house. If we cry, then we're called a crybaby. If we get angry, we're called a bully. If we're afraid of something, we're a scaredy cat, or a sissy, right? And if we're told that we're complaining about something, it's not that bad. And so on, and we're to be numb or to be careful. And that is that, anything that's done wrong will shame the family. And so we need to please people. We need to try to be perfect. We want love, so we need to do it right or it won't be there. We need to be careful. And we need to be good. And so she writes all these things, and a lot of times it comes out. And Kurt Thomas writes a great little passage here from his book, The Soul of Shame. And he talks about how often, we're simply just trying to do things that we want. We're trying to do things that we enjoy, and we're not paying attention, and yet it interrupts the caregiver. Something's going wrong, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a shearing of, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? Stop that. Quit making that noise. And all of a sudden, this shame comes upon us, right? And so there was a case he talked about where this girl asked her mother if she could invite some of the classmates over to her house to play, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, out of the blue, this unexpected shearing effect of shame when her mother answers irritably, "No, how many times have I told you we can't do that?" Now there's a certain shearing off of that joy that the girl had, thinking, hey, I'm going to invite some friends, a blindsiding, right, that overtakes her and completely catches her off guard. There's no, putting on the brakes. Instead, it's like a freight train that comes and crashes all the things together, and she has this emotional reaction, right? An emotional reaction of shame and maybe anger and things that, conclude like, what's going on? What's wrong with me? And if there's no repair, then we're left alone thinking there's something wrong with me, obviously, or my parents wouldn't be so upset. There's a lowering of the shoulders, the gaze away, a heaviness in the chest, and unrepaired, we are left with this sense of shame. We can't explain why. And that's why I talk about rupture and repair. Children are resilient. They understand when we have ups and downs. They understand when we blow our tops or get upset, but we come back and we repair it. And we let them know it isn't about them. It was about the situation, that they're lovable and we care for them. But so many never heard that. So many never had the repair side of it. And so they're left feeling shame. Sandra Wilson, Dr. Wilson, talks about this, and I've given you some charts where she talks about shameful attitudes toward emotion and the truth about emotions. For example, she says, some of us believe emotions are unnecessary, bothersome, and embarrassing, where the truth about emotions is that they're a gift from God and an integral part of my human nature which reflects His image. Or emotions are bad and dangerous, so I'm safer when I avoid them. And rather, the truth is, she says, emotions are neither good nor bad. Emotions can be expressed appropriately, and I can learn to do that. I am less of what God created me to be when I'm avoiding feeling my emotions, and that's what shame does. Shame locks us down, shuts us off. Another one, when I felt sad as a child, no one was there for me. I couldn't stand to feel that despair and loneliness again. But the truth is, I have resources now as an adult that I didn't have as a child. I can find more reliable, although not perfect, human comforters. And I know, or can know, God personally and have His comfort. It will be painful to grieve childhood losses, but I can stand it. And you can read some of the other things that she wrote there too. And she starts talking about how can we overcome some of this. And that's what we're going to get into in the next lesson. How can we overcome some of this toxic shame? And she talks about moving toward the middle. That there's, we can be the weak victim, or we can overcompensate and try to be the rescuer, but it's somewhere we need instead to be a human adult. And let me give you an example. The weak victim says, I'm so weak, I'm a wreck. And the rescuer, right, the over-responsible says, I have to be strong, so I'm like a rock. Well, maybe the human reaction is, I have strengths and weaknesses. I am a human being, and God and I are okay with that. And that's hard. If you've been on either side of these, it's hard to believe that middle part. Another one, everything is just too much for me. On the other hand, I cannot let anyone down, therefore nothing is too much for me. Well, how about the middle? Some things are overwhelming and too much for me, but nothing is too much for God. And so hence the need, I believe, and is that we need God. God didn't mean for us to be alone, and we need fellowship, and we overcome shame in healthy relationships. Our relationship with God and our relationship with others. As we learn to receive unconditional love. I believe unconditional love and God's grace are the most powerful things in the universe. And we need to know more about unconditional love. And so we return to joy and peace and the fruit of the Spirit when we start to believe. Now you'll remember not too long ago when I told you in my own case that I felt unlovable. Unlovable. And the counselor told me, Ron, you don't believe in self-annihilation, you don't have a self. And he asked me, Ron, do you believe God loves you? And I said, no. I remember the shame I felt. I was down like this. Ron, do you believe your wife loves me? And she's sitting there crying, and I'm looking at her with tears in her face, and I'm just, talk about the posture of shame. And I'm just like that, and I look up and quiver, and I go, no. But the truth is, in my head, I knew that my wife loved me of all people, and I knew God loved me, but I felt unlovable. And I had to start a process of retraining myself to truly believe in my heart, not just my head, that God's unconditional love was for me. And my friends, it's for you too. And so I encourage you, read the notes. If you don't have them, you can write me at ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send them to you. And next time, we'll talk about how do we overcome this toxic shame.